Hi guys, so today we're going to continue talking about the 1800s and some more policies that happened while Andrew Jackson was president, but we're going to focus on how it affected the Native Americans living in the United States during that time. So in the early 1800s, there was quite a few Native American communities that flourished. And what that means is that they were successful in many things. In the Southeast, we had the groups the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee, and the Seminole, and they all had signed treaties with the United States. And what these treaties said is that the natives had control over their lands and they were protected from all of these new settlers who were coming into their lands. So because the United States was expanding and we had a lot of Americans moving into this land that the natives already lived in, the natives and the US government signed agreements saying that the natives were going to keep their land and the United States would protect their land. During this time, many native groups developed schools, they developed local governments, so they had their own communities, similar to the early natives that we talked about way back in the beginning of the school year in chapter 2. One group in particular who we're going to talk about a lot is the Cherokee, and they developed their own Native American alphabet. And the person who developed this was a Cherokee silversmith named Sequoyah. And he borrowed different symbols and different letters from other alphabets and other languages, and finally finished an alphabet with 85 symbols. And each of those symbols, like you can see in the picture, was associated with a Cherokee sound from their language. And that helped natives learn how to read and write. So many Cherokee natives were very intelligent and they were able to communicate in their language. They also developed a newspaper and they called it the Cherokee Phoenix. And in the newspaper, they would highlight some issues that the Cherokee were facing and a lot of different articles about the events that were going on during this time. The leader during this time, so Sequoyah, he was very respected. He was an educator. And in fact, the California redwood that is very famous here in our forest, called the Sequoyah, is named in his honor. I don't know why this thingy doesn't go away. But anyways, so yes, the natives were flourishing during this time, but they also faced a lot of hard times too. And that's what we're going to focus on, talking about what policies were put in place that affected the natives. So as we mentioned, more and more settlers are moving into the Southeast, and this is causing conflicts between the white settlers and the natives who are living there. So remember, we've talked about the natives were here, this was their land, and they're being kind of like invaded, or their land is taken over by these settlers who are wanting to move more to the undiscovered parts of the North American continent where white settlers hadn't discovered yet. Another thing that arose during this time was that in 1830, gold was discovered on Cherokee lands in Georgia. So these disagreements grew worse because now the white settlers are wanting to live in this area so that they could look for gold, so that they can become wealthy. But the natives don't want to give up their land. The Cherokee don't want to give up their land in Georgia. At this time, when Andrew Jackson was a general, he fought different campaigns against the natives. So before he became president, when he was a soldier, he would fight against natives. He used to see them as a threat. And he saw them as a threat, especially to U.S. expansion. Remember that Andrew Jackson was super for making the U.S. bigger. He wanted more people to move into these lands and to increase the migration of settlers throughout all of the United States. But because the natives were here, he saw them as a threat because they were not going to allow these settlers to settle in their land. He also had a plan to move all of the Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. So that Louisiana Purchase that we got that expanded the United States and made it 2 times bigger. He wanted an area in that piece of land that was only for natives. So he wanted to move all of them and place them into one spot. And this process was called the Indian Removal Act. So in 1830, Congress, so the House of Representatives and the Senate, passed the Indian Removal Act. And this law allowed the presidents to remove all of their natives from their homelands and relocate them to this area called Indian Territory. And it's what we know now as the state of Oklahoma. So all of the natives that were living all throughout the United States were going to be moved and placed into this one area. So all of them had to live in the same spot. I'm going to show you a map on the next slide so that you can see what I'm talking about. Many Americans, so many white Americans, spoke out against the move. In fact, one person, Davy Crockett, who was a legislator, he was a congressman, he spoke out and said that it was wrong. And because he kind of stood up for his beliefs and went against a lot of other Americans, he lost re-election. So people didn't want him to be part of Congress anymore because they didn't agree with his beliefs. But he kept his conscience. He knew that he was trying to fight for the rights of the natives, even though he was not going to be in Congress anymore. So starting in 1831, the government began to force natives to leave their homes. It started with the Choctaw, then the Chickasaw, and then the Muskogee. So they were the first groups to leave. Those people who were or who refused to leave, so if they kind of stayed behind, they were forced into slavery. And after this, the Cherokee were the next group to leave. And despite being treated so harshly, they refused to leave. And in Georgia, where the Cherokee were living, the government had a lottery to see which white settlers were going to own their land or who were going to take over their Cherokee farms. Here's the map of the different groups and where they lived and where they had to move. So we start off with the Choctaw, the Chickasaw. So this large group is where most of those natives lived, and they had to take a route into this area. So this is where Oklahoma is, but back then it wasn't the state of Oklahoma yet. It was called Indian Territory. So all of these different groups, and we're going to talk about the Cherokee next and then the Seminole, all these groups had to move into this one area. And you can see how in this one spot, those different groups are divided. You can see also the trails that they had to take and how kind of far they had to travel in order to get to Indian Territory. Okay, so let's talk about the Trail of Tears, and this is unfortunately one of the saddest parts of Native American history. So after the Indian Removal Act passed, the Cherokee did not want to move. They didn't want to relocate. So they went to the U.S. Supreme Court to stop the government from forcing them out of Georgia. The court actually said that Georgia could not remove the natives, so they were not allowed to force the Cherokee out of their land. However, President Jackson refused to obey the court's ruling and ordered that the Cherokee be removed. So in 1838, he sent soldiers to round up the Cherokee. They burned their homes, and they forced them to march 800 miles to Indian Territory. Along the way, it was a harsh route they had to take. It was cold. They had to travel many, many miles without food and harsh conditions. So, in their language, they named this march the place where they cried. And today we know it as the Trail of Tears. The march took more than a year, and although it's not for sure how many Cherokee passed away along the way, history says about 4,000 out of 15,000 Cherokee passed away. Okay, so another group that was also part of the relocation was the Seminole, and the Seminole were in Florida. So they were a group of natives who were living in the Everglades in Florida. The United States fought against them in an attempt to drive them from their homelands. So they were hoping that this attack against the Seminoles would kind of just make them move into Indian Territory. And because of the fighting in 1832, some of the Seminole leaders decided to sign a treaty agreeing to relocate. So some said, okay, yes, we're going to leave, we're going to go into Indian Territory, but there was also a group of Seminoles who refused to leave. And one of the leaders, named Ocelio, he led an army against the government troops. Unfortunately, the U.S. Army captured Ocelio because they tricked him, kind of saying that they were there for a peaceful agreement, but it wasn't true. So they captured him, and he died in prison. But the Seminoles continued to resist, and they fought over 50 years against the U.S. Army, trying to keep their land and keep their people in their land. So over the course of 50 years, the United States spent about $40 million on the Seminole Wars, and eventually the United States removed 3,000 Seminole, and they had to relocate to the Indian Territory. And they also killed about 1,500 Seminole. There was only a few hundred who survived, and they remained in Florida during this time, so in the Everglades. So for today's assignment, we're going to try something new, so please listen to the directions so you're not lost. They're also attached in the instructions for today's assignment. But there is a new program that we're going to try out, and it's a reading program that has questions attached to it that you can answer as you read along. And that program is called Actively Learn. So there's a link that I attached to this assignment, and all you have to do is click on it and make sure you log in with your school email. So your Google Classroom email, the Gmail that you normally use. You're going to log in, and it should already be connected to your Google Classroom. So go ahead and follow the steps to log in. And then once there, you're going to see a reading assignment that's based on this book. It's called The Trail of Tears by Joseph Buchak. And what you're going to do is you're going to read through it, and there are some questions at the end of each passage. So make sure you look out for those and you answer them. And as you answer them, they are already being logged in to Actively Learn. So I'll get your questions as you answer. If you have any questions, send me a message. Take some time to read over the chapters in the book. It's pretty interesting. It gives you more details about what the natives went through and what kind of situations they faced during this time. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions, and if not, I'll talk to you later. Bye.